Thanks, Clarence. I'd like you to imagine, if you will, for a moment, that we are together going to conduct a psychological experiment. And so for the purposes of the experiment, we can recruit two groups of people. And we tell them two different stories. We tell Group A that they will each be spending the night alone in a maximum security prison cell. And we tell Group B that they will each be spending the night at a 5-star resort hotel room. But then we blindfold both groups, and we take them to the same cheap motel at which we have covered up all the windows. We take them each to their room, take off their blindfold, and bid them good night. The following morning, we go to each room and conduct exit interviews. We ask each participant what they thought of their accommodations. What do you think they'll say? Well, I imagine that the members of Group A would be pleasantly surprised by their experience, and the members of Group B will likely be disappointed. Why the difference? I mean, both groups stayed in essentially the same type of room. Why was Group A pleased and Group B disappointed? Well, it's simple. Expectations. Group A probably expected something like a tiny room with a bare cement floor, no windows, maybe a cot and a toilet. Those in Group B likely expected a large suite with plush carpeting, a king-size bed, a large screen television, and perhaps a hot tub in the private bathroom. Here's the thing. Expectations determine experiences. Our expectations often determine our experiences. And you know this to be true. You've had this experience as well. Maybe you've had this happen to you. A new movie comes out in the theaters, and a good friend of yours really knows nothing about the movie, but goes to see it anyway. And she just loves it, and she just can't stop talking about it. She thinks it's one of the best movies perhaps she's ever seen, and so she urges you to go see it on the big screen. And so you do. You go to the theater expecting to just kind of be blown out of your seat with this amazing spectacle. Well, the movie starts out kind of slow, and you keep expecting it's going to ramp up pretty soon. And you recognize some of the scenes that your friend told you about, but they're really not even as good as your friend's retelling of those scenes. And nothing about the movie really grabs you. It doesn't move you. You're certainly not impressed. And by the time the credits roll, you're rather disappointed. What's the difference? Expectations. Your friend went with no real expectations and came away pleasantly surprised. You went with kind of a hyper-inflated set of expectations, and so you were disappointed. Expectation determines experience. Expectation often does a great deal to determine our experience. Now, why am I saying all this? I say it because how you experience the Christian life will largely depend on what you expect from it. So what do you expect? And how do we even know what to expect? Well, many of our expectations about the Christian life are shaped by God's promises in His Word. And a particular favorite promise for many Christians is in today's passage. Romans 8:28. It might be very familiar to you. It says this, "And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose." I suspect this is one of the most often quoted verses in all of the New Testament. But I would also guess that it's one of the most misinterpreted as well. So this morning I want to take a closer look at this verse. Let's begin with what this verse does not mean. It does not mean that God will never let anything bad happen to us. Okay? It does not mean that everything that happens to us is good. How do we know that? Well, we can see this rather easily simply by reading the verse in its context. So much is cleared up when you read scriptures in their context. So read some of the verses around that. For example, is trouble good? Is hardship good? Is persecution good? How about famine, poverty, homelessness, danger, physical assault, violence? Are those things good? Is death good? Are demons good? No, not at all. But notice that in verses 35 and 38, they both say that these kinds of things will happen to us. So clearly, this verse cannot be used to teach that nothing bad will ever happen to a Christian. And yet there are those who teach exactly that. It also does not mean that God will take all the bad things that happen to us and turn them into good things. Sometimes Christians will say things like, "Oh, I heard about you losing your job. That's too bad. I'm sorry. But don't worry. God will give you an even better one." After all, God works all things together for our good, right? Well, let's think about that for a moment. Does losing your job mean that God is going to give you a better job? Better pay? Better hours? Better boss? Well, no. What does it mean if you lose your job? Well, it means that you've lost your job. You might get a better job. You might get a worse job. You might not get any job at all. It is possible that the job you just lost could be the best job you will ever have. Verse 28 is not a promise that God will turn every economic downturn into an ultimate financial gain. Or another example. Sometimes, in a well-meaning effort to comfort someone, we might say something like this: "Oh, I heard about what happened. I'm sorry that your fiance broke off the engagement. That's got to be very painful. But you know what? That must mean that God has someone even better picked out for you." Romans 8:28 says, "We know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him." Is this true? Does a canceled wedding automatically mean a better marriage to come? No. Then what does it mean? It means the wedding has been canceled. All it means is that you will not be marrying that person. You might find a better mate. You might not. And you may never get married at all. Verse 28 is not a promise that God will turn every relationship failure into a relational triumph. So this popular verse does not mean that God will never let anything bad happen to us, or that God will take all the bad things that happen to us and turn them into good things. Then what does it mean? Well, let's look again at verse 28. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Again, it does not say that God will take all the bad things that happen to us and turn them into good things. It says that God will take whatever happens to us, whether it's good or bad, and use it for our good. Again, he doesn't necessarily turn the bad things into good things. He uses the bad things for our good. Now, this might sound like an odd question, but I believe it's a critical question to ask. What is our good? What is our good? What's he talking about? What is the good that God is working toward? If we want to answer I'm sorry, I say this because if we get the answer to this question wrong, we actually might spend our whole lives pursuing the wrong things and end up disappointed and even disillusioned. So what is God's objective here? What is his goal? Well, we find it in the very next verse, in verse 29. For those God foreknew, he also predestined. Why? Predestined us for what? To be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brothers and sisters. Paul is very clear here. God's goal is godliness. To borrow from author Gary Thomas, God's ultimate desire is not to make you happy, but rather to make you holy. His purpose is not that we become comfortable, but that we become Christ-like. So I think it would be legitimate to revise verse 28 to read this way, and perhaps this is helpful. And we know that in all things God works for the godliness of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. That's his purpose. That's what he calls us to. Our good is Christ-like character. Our good is holy hearts. Our good is righteous relationships. Our good is godliness. God's promise is that he will use all the things that happen to us, both good and bad things, to conform us into the image of his Son, Jesus Christ. But you know, being conformed to the image of his Son is not always fun, is it? For example, you don't learn to become a patient person by having an easy, trouble-free life. And you don't become a gracious and forgiving person by never having anyone hurt you. And you don't develop the ability to love your enemies by never having any. In his book, If God is Good, Randy Alcorn said this: God doesn't simply want us to feel good, he wants us to be good. And very often, the road to being good involves not feeling good. Even Jesus, we are told, quote, learned obedience from what he suffered, unquote. Hebrews 5. Which raises a question, I think. The question is this: if God uses suffering to make us more like Jesus, does this mean that suffering is good? If suffering is good for us, is suffering itself good? No. Categorically, no. Suffering, in fact, is evil. How can I say that? Well, we can know that for at least two reasons. Number one, there was no suffering or pain in the Garden of Eden. And number two, there will be no pain or suffering in the new heaven or new earth. Suffering was not part of God's original plan, and it will not be part of our eternity. So there is nothing inherently good about suffering. Let's be clear. Suffering is bad, and we should avoid it whenever possible. But God still likes to use it. God still likes to use it. In fact, it seems to be one of his very favorite tools. And perhaps this is because pain is such an effective tool for making us more like Jesus. And does this in a whole variety of ways. And here's a sampling. How suffering sanctifies us. First, it strips us of our self-sufficiency and our self-reliance. And it causes us to lean on Jesus. It deepens our dependence on him. It also exposes our idols. Because in times of great pain, whatever we turn to for strength and comfort, that is our God. It also emasculates our idols. It shows us that our idols are impotent, that they fail us, that they make lousy saviors. And it purifies our faith. It tests our motives, causes us to ask, am I serving Jesus for his sake or for mine? Do I worship God because he is worthy or because I'm hoping for some kind of divine kickback? It also proclaims our faith and makes it more convincing to a skeptical world. Because when you receive no immediate or tangible benefit from trusting God, but you do it anyway, that's compelling. When your faith in God seems to yield only punishment and pain, but you trust him anyway, that is a testimony difficult to ignore. And when I think about that, I'm reminded of people I've known. Men like Everett Jensen, Dan Carlson, Kevin Snyder. God did not waste their pain. He used it like a megaphone to shout his gospel to a deaf world. Suffering, let's be clear, suffering is not good. And God is going to destroy it someday. But in the meantime, he likes to use it because it's so effective at making us more like Jesus. Aren't you glad you came to church today? Just to get a little encouragement. I came here today to cheer you up. But how many of you have heard these words before? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. You heard that before? Can anybody tell me what that's from? You guys are so much faster than the first service. The Declaration of Independence. The framers of this document declared that all people have a God-given and irrevocable right to pursue happiness. Have you ever stopped to consider whether or not that is true? I will argue that this statement is not only wrong-headed, it is dangerous. But this assertion that we should all pursue happiness is very difficult to refute because many of our cultural values are based squarely on this myth. You may have never even thought to question it before because it's just assumed. It's kind of part of the air we breathe. So for example, if you were to select almost any American parent at random, grab a parent off the street, names for your children, what do you want them to become when they grow up? Here's how they would probably answer. You know, I don't really care. I'm not as concerned about what they do. I don't really care if they become doctors and lawyers. No, I was going to say that. Again, it's just in the air we breathe, isn't it? I just want my children to be happy. And when we hear that, we all nod in agreement, affirming this as a noble end. We admire them for having the wisdom to reject bald materialism and greed in favor of the more elusive but satisfying happiness. So when we hear a parent say, I just want my children to be happy, we don't even question that. In the words of the framers of the Declaration of Independence, it seems like a self-evident truth. Of course. We all want our children to be happy, don't we? What kind of parent would I be if I didn't want that? What kind of parent doesn't want their children to be happy? It's such an obvious conclusion that it never even comes up for discussion. It's just assumed. It usually doesn't even occur to us to question it. But it should. It should. I believe we should question it, and I will argue that we should also reject it. We should reject that as a dream for our children, and we should abandon that as a goal for ourselves. Why? 2 reasons. Number 1, it doesn't work. And number 2, it's not God's primary goal for us. So number 1, it doesn't work. And it doesn't work because you cannot achieve happiness by direct effort. Happiness is a derivative emotion. It comes as a byproduct of other circumstances. If you pursue happiness directly, it will elude you. You can only get to happiness indirectly. So, for example, let's say that you, in your heart of hearts, more than anything, really want to have a delightfully happy family gathering this Christmas. It's July, so we should be thinking about this. Now, perhaps you remember a particularly happy moment at a previous Christmas celebration when everyone was getting along and seemed genuinely content. Or perhaps you have derived your dream from an eclectic mix of Thomas Kincaid paintings and Hallmark Hall of Fame movies. Either way, you have this romanticized notion of what the ideal family gathering would look like, what it would feel like. Now, you might not admit it out loud. In fact, you might not even be aware of it yourself. But that is your unconscious goal, to have a Norman Rockwell moment with your family. So for weeks in advance, you plan every element, the menu, the ingredients, the decorations, the table setting. And you spend hours poring over every detail, preparing to create the perfect environment, bound and determined to manufacture sublime transcendence and heavenly bliss. But when the much anticipated day arrives, everything seems to just fall apart for you. For starters, a snowstorm blocks parts of Interstate 70, so your daughter and her family have to cancel at the last minute. And your heart sinks as you pull their place settings from the table. And then Aunt Josie, who is late, forgets to bring the mashed potatoes. Now, you baked the turkey and the ham. You made the stuffing and the cranberry salad and the yams. All Aunt Josie had to do was bring the mashed potatoes. But she didn't. And, you try hard not to let it bother you, but it does. And now there's nothing to put the gravy on, which you also made. And in spite of all your best efforts and your exhaustive Pinterest research, you still manage to burn the crust on the pecan pie. And your husband is going to be sorely disappointed. Now, as the finishing touches are being put on the table, your son gets into a heated debate over his political differences with Cousin Joe. And now they refuse to sit next to each other. You had imagined a warm and joyful dinner conversation about God or about family or perhaps about the simple pleasures of good food, with everyone lingering over that last bite of their dessert. But everyone seems to just rush through dinner, barely noticing your sumptuous stuffing, but making jokes about the burnt sacrifice that was once a pecan pie. And even this, you barely have time to notice because you scarcely have time to sit down. Throughout the meal, there are countless details to attend to. And so you run back and forth from the kitchen to the dining room, waiting on everyone, hand and foot. And yet they totally take it for granted. And then they all abandon you and rush off to watch TV. And you are left in a kitchen that looks like a war zone, trying to figure out where to begin. And then you hear snippets of It's a Wonderful Life drifting in from the family room as you survey the rubble that was supposed to be the perfect family gathering. And perhaps you didn't even realize until this moment how badly you wanted this to be a happy Christmas memory. But now you wish you could forget the whole event ever happened. And your deep disappointment makes you feel lonely as you stand in the kitchen with hot tears of hurt and frustration falling from your cheeks. Sound familiar? Maybe that's not what it is for you. Maybe it's something else. But whatever it is that you're using to find happiness or to manufacture it, it proves elusive, doesn't it? In fact, often the harder you try to achieve happiness, the harder it is to find. And even if you do find it, you can't seem to hold on to it. It just doesn't stay. Why is that? It's because happiness cannot be attained through direct effort. Happiness is not achieved. It is derived. It comes as a byproduct of something else, something that is good. Happiness happens occasionally, but if you try to make it happen, it will usually slip right through your fingers. And if you try to force it, it's likely to backfire. So I contend that we should reject happiness as our ultimate goal for our children, and we should abandon it as our dream as well. Because it doesn't work. And more importantly, because it's not God's goal for us. You see, God created us. He created us. He designed us to work in a certain way. And we are the happiest when we function the way we are designed. And what were we designed for? Relationship. Primarily relationship with Him. We are created to know, love, worship, and serve a holy God. And in the process, become like Him. And when we do that, we're happy. And when we don't, we're not. Happiness is not achieved, it is derived. So here's the irony. While God's ultimate goal for us is not happiness, we cannot experience true and lasting joy unless we pursue what is His goal for us: holiness. So I encourage you, don't pursue happiness. Pursue holiness. If you pursue happiness, you will achieve neither. If you pursue holiness, you may experience both. Because happiness is a derivative of holiness. And happiness is also predicated on our expectations. When your expectations are met, you tend to be happy. When they are not met, it can lead to disappointment, frustration, disillusionment. So if your desire, think about this for a moment, if your desire and expectation is to be happy, if your goal is to be happy, then any troubling or tragic circumstance can destroy it. But if your desire and expectation is to become holy, then nothing can hinder you. Even the most horrible circumstances can be used of God to prune and purge and shape us into His image. In fact, nothing, literally nothing, whether good or bad, can thwart God's goal to mold you into His likeness. no matter what happens to you, he can use it to produce his character in you. And if that is your goal, if that is your objective, if that's your expectation, then you can experience genuine joy even in the midst of terrible suffering. Now, I realize that this has been somewhat of a heavy sermon, and so I want to leave you with this reminder, and I hope it's an encouragement to you. The words of Paul from chapter 8. And we know that in all things, God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. For those God foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son. If God is for us, who can be against us? He who did not spare his own Son, but gave him up for us all, how will he not also, along with him, graciously give us all things? Who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall trouble, or hardship, or persecution, or famine, or nakedness, or danger, or sword? No. No. In all these things we are more than conquerors through him who loved us. For I am convinced, you say it with me, for I am convinced that neither death nor life, neither angels nor demons, neither the present nor the future, nor any powers, neither height nor depth, nor anything else in all creation will be able to separate us from the love of God that is in Christ Jesus our Lord. Amen.